So in our house, we've become pretty big fans of a TV show called Holy Moly on ABC. If you've never seen it, it's essentially American Ninja Warrior or Wipeout meets the game of mini golf. Brave souls take to the green, forced to navigate all sorts of ridiculous hazards, irrational traps, and impossible lies to put a small round ball in a tiny hole. At times, grit, endurance, tenacity, and sheer willpower will get the contestants further than their golf skills or athletic ability ever will. It's eerily similar, remarkably analogous, really, to the process of creating content in a large enterprise. Here you are with this perfectly formed idea, or little white ball. You have the perfect place to put it, or the hole, and you're a reasonable distance away. Eventually you'll get there, but how many hazards you'll have to hit, traps you'll have to navigate, or shots you'll have to take is a complete mystery when you take to the tee, no matter your ability or your handicap. The good news is some of the obstacles on the course are somewhat predictable and totally navigable with a little planning and a smart approach. And that's what we're going to talk about today. At brand Publis, we specialize in messaging, content, and marketing transformation for pretty complex B2B products and services. We've consistently run into some of these obstacles and have actually changed some of our services a fair bit in order to tackle them. So we're going to share with you what we've learned looking at 3 specific obstacles on the course of messaging and content creation and what you can do to play through. I'll never forget one of my first big B2B projects with a pretty big technology company. We were actually brought in to help them develop a point of view around data in support of their data products and services portfolio. At least we weren't talking about an overly saturated topic with an endless sea of solutions, heated opinions, and different philosophies or anything. So we were off, talking to people, workshopping the ideas, and building a narrative. We put together something we thought was pretty compelling, and we brought it back to the executive sponsor of the project. The next day, he immediately took it to a client meeting, and the client was in. So here we are thinking this is a hole-in-one. We were just about to pop the champagne when he hits us with, "You just need to take it to this guy over in Europe to see what he thinks about it. That'd be really great if you could do that." So that individual then added 4 of his country leaders to the call, who each sent us off to 3 or 4 more people, a managing director of a major account, a product executive on a tangentially related product line, an alliance leader, an ecosystem executive, and so it went for about 2 weeks. By the time we were done getting referred, we had a meager list of about 72 people who we were told needed to see, weigh in on, and bless the messaging before we could even get to work on actually building any of the assets and offers that would bring it to market. So that brings us to our first hole in the course, which feels a lot like hole number 2 in Holy Moly. It looks like a clean shot, no bunkers, no hills, no wind, a straight shot you could make with your eyes closed, until suddenly out of nowhere, one character after another literally pops out of the woodwork. Aligning across organizational silos is a legitimate challenge in any business, but in a large, often highly matrixed organization, reaching across those departmental boundaries not only impacts the work, but quickly blows your timelines out of the water, which is probably why the 2 biggest challenges mentioned by marketing professionals in big businesses are focused on exactly that: coordinating across brands and departments and managing the organizational silos that seem to naturally emerge. We argue a lot of the other challenges are actually byproducts of that silo problem. Different leaders, different agendas, different technology stacks make consistency that much more challenging in a big business. Now, clearly in businesses that rival the GDP of entire nations, complexity isn't going to disappear. If anything, the rate of change and transactional nature of business today are going to make it feel like it's a continuously moving target. So how do you embrace the complexity to manage stakeholders in a way that keeps things moving? We focus on 3 things: mapping, building, and selling. First is mapping your stakeholders appropriately. Based on the work you're trying to push over the finish line, who are the actual people who really need to be involved in the process? More often than not, what we find is the teams we work with know exactly who needs to contribute, whose brain power they need to tap in order to create that messaging or content. But we believe there are actually two other groups beyond those contributors who can make or break your timelines. The first are the people you need to like what you're building, or the people you might want to like it for the sake of selling it more easily across the business, like key clients, strategy leaders, analysts, or even alliances or key partners. The second are the people who can block it. We've been burned here, honestly, a number of times on everything from blog posts and social copy to corporate narratives. The design department, the legal team, crisis communications, they all play a really important role in the business. And if they're not embraced the right way in the process of creating content or messaging, they can often become blockers to getting things done. Now, these teams are unfairly looked at a lot of times. They're seen as negative when in fact, if they're involved and embraced the right way at the right time, they can add a ton of value. We have a client right now who actually wants to bring in her lead counsel because of her deep expertise and knowledge on the regulatory environment that's facing their clients. She can actually help us make the messaging and the marketing that much more impactful. Now, the reason we see it as a mapping exercise is that your first list, once you've covered off on all three of those buckets, the contributors, the people you want to like it, and the people that can actually block it, will probably look something like my earlier story if you're working on anything that's reasonably big or has impact for the business. So before you know it, that list can be completely out of control. The mapping exercise is how you make it more manageable. First, figure out who influences whom on your list. Who are the cool kids that the other kids are going to listen to? Once you have those groups figured out, you can map where they belong in your process. Should they help you build it? Do they just need to review it to check some boxes and sign off? That helps you spread the stakeholders out strategically through the process. Doing all this work up front helps you build the stakeholders into the process so they're not popping up on you unexpectedly, disrupting your flow and tanking your timelines. The first few times you do this, it might feel like a lot of work, but before you know it, it's taking you no more than an hour or so. And as you get comfortable with players and relationships, it gets even quicker. The second area we focus on is how we go about building the messaging or the content. Now, obviously, if you're talking about a blog post, the idea of a co-creation and writing by committee would feel like hanging out in the seventh circle of hell. On the flip side, building an elevator pitch in a vacuum and then trying to take it out to sell it and get buy-in is basically like spending a day in a torture chamber. But every aspect of your creation process opens up an opportunity to set you up for success when you come out the other side, from the research that you do and the approach that you take to outlining the work. Two tactics in particular we find to be really helpful. We're big fans of one-on-one or one-to-few interviews that we do before we really start getting into crafting the work. Before we do any effort, we look at our stakeholder list to see who really needs to be heard in order to capture their ideas and their thoughts because they're knowledgeable on the process, but then also who needs to be heard because of their opinions and because of the influence they have on other people. It not only helps us make the content better, but it helps us identify the vocabulary, the analogies, the stories, the data points that really resonate with those people. When we're able to build those into the messaging or into the content, our odds of not only selling it, but getting people excited about it are that much higher. Second, we tend to use cross-functional workshops a lot in what we do. These don't tend to be necessary for smaller pieces of content or one-off messaging projects, but if you're doing something higher profile, they fill a really important role. Whenever you're dealing with a big group, you're gonna have factions that just don't agree with each other, or maybe they just don't talk to each other at all. We find if we facilitate discussions with dissenting or uncommunicative groups, we not only get to a better end result, we get them aligned. So whatever we're building gets a lot more buy-in and support right from the get-go. For example, when we drive narrative work, We always try to get representation from across marketing, sales, and some sort of product function, be it engineering, product management, or product development. We find that if we get the teams listening to and learning from one another, they also start to develop more empathy. All that said, if you have a particularly prickly crowd that doesn't get along, bring in the Swiss. Find an independent person to come in and facilitate the discussion. It absolutely helps. That brings us to step number 3, which is making the sale. And the good news is, because of all of the work you've already done to identify your stakeholders and to figure out what to talk about, you have all the ingredients you need to pitch. You know who you need to pitch to because of your mapping, and what you need to lean into because of your interviews and all of those working sessions. We try our best to do the reviews in a strategic order. We try really hard, calendars permitting, to put some of the higher profile folks first, people that other people are going to listen to. So for example, analysts or friendly clients, since their opinions tend to carry a lot more weight universally across the audiences. From there, we structure the order so that we're compiling as much evidence as we go as possible. Oh, so-and-so said this, or this person really liked that, because when we have those data points, it makes the sale that much easier. And what we find when we get it right is that we can move through the reviews with only small language tweaks or ordering issues versus a complete and utter rewrite. The most important thing when it comes to stakeholders is to do the planning upfront. And of course, to make everything proportional. If you need 75 people to review a blog post, for example, maybe pick a different topic. One of the coolest things about conducting interviews is comparing the answers after the fact. We always start with a pretty good discussion around the audience. And one of the most fascinating things to see is how inconsistent the answers can be when we ask people, who is it that you feel the business needs to talk to? Top executives tend to hold relationships at the higher level in the organization and tend to think talking to executives and CEOs is the most important. Product people are often very focused on the people using the product or consuming the services. Salespeople often have contacts that they've built over the years that they really like to talk to. And sometimes those people are actually different to the people that they need to talk to in order to close the deal. Strategy teams are selling the future, alliance teams are selling with other people, and delivery teams are selling through existing clients. By the time you get to the marketing team, marketing's trying to figure out how to rationalize all of these different targets, account for industries, tailor for geographies, and then divide the budget to create enough content to deliver highly personalized messages across all of those individual groups. I haven't met a company yet whose budgets can effectively stretch that much, at least not without some serious prioritization and focus. So that brings us to the second hole on the course of messaging and content creation, which looks suspiciously like Dutch courage in Holy Moly. The more audiences, the more likely you are to get thrown overboard if you don't show up in the right way in exactly the right moment. And just when you think you've made it through, you take a hit. Obviously, when you're dealing with complex businesses boasting really complex product, solution, or service portfolios, you're going to cater to a lot of different audiences. But aligning on who generally matters, and more importantly, why they should care, is a pretty essential first step, particularly as audiences are becoming increasingly particular. As awesome as the past few years have been in making the world more convenient in a lot of ways, it's taken already high expectations to an entirely new level. Customers and prospects are far more likely to bail on you after one bad experience. They're expecting brands to know increasingly and reference more often their purchase history. They're looking for responses on social media, sometimes as fast as immediately. That's a pretty new development. And they expect the brands they buy from to share their values. That last one has been on the rise for a few years now, and it's putting even more pressure on relevance, which in turn is putting more pressure on segmentation and how well brands know their audiences, how well they understand what really matters to them. Just recently, we were working on a corporate messaging project with a large services firm. We completed about 20 or so different interviews and workshops. And when we rationalized all the different audiences, we ended up with about 35, I think, different roles that different groups were trying to cater to and talk to. Now, that number isn't all that concerning, but when you look at how wildly different the conversations were, role to role and group to group, building messaging and content that had a chance of scaling became really, really hard. So the team took a step back and classified the audiences a bit differently. Instead of looking at the individual groups and the individual services and trying to match up who benefits from what and why, they actually took it up to the corporate level and said, based on the purpose of our organization, what really motivates any of these individuals or groups of individuals to engage with us? And that let them move from 35 different roles that they were catering to in 35 different ways and get them to 8 really strong groups of like-minded individuals, motivated by the same kinds of things. That was a huge benefit downstream. Rather than trying to build and maintain relevant positioning and assets and content for 35 different roles, the team could build and maintain core value statements for these 8 groups that could then be tailored based on industry, based on geography, based on role, and current activities in the market that were relevant to the individual. So rather than maintaining all of these individual assets, they could maintain this value statement structure that they could continue to modify over time and learn about and improve. The team went further to take those 8 audience groupings and really prioritize it based on the conversations that were happening in the market, which took them down to a few core groups that they felt they had a huge opportunity to message to really amplify the presence of the brand in the market. That level of prioritization gave the group the room and time to really dig in and learn about these prioritized audiences. And that was true for everyone, from sales through to marketing, which takes us to the really important work of getting to understand the needs and aspirations of the audiences that you're targeting. One of the hardest parts about getting too big as a company are the layers of process that inevitably get created. Marketers, out of necessity, often have to pivot to become more focused on production and process, spending less time actually engaging with, learning from, and most importantly, co-creating with their audiences. We find one of the best uses of time whenever we're running a project is to set aside time to talk about the audience with a cross-functional group. Doesn't have to be a big group, doesn't have to be a lot of time. Even 30, 45 minutes, an hour can add a lot of value, especially for the people who aren't on the front lines having the conversations day in and day out. For bigger projects, we often use a workshop format where we invite cross-functional teams to share what they know about the needs and aspirations of the audiences that they're talking to. Sharing inputs from sales conversations, product or service testing, NPS, even marketing asset performance can really help scale client learning across the teams, enriching everything from the marketing to the content to the sales engagements. We often use design thinking exercises to get people to share out everything they've heard and seen. Then we take the time to compile those into buckets or themes that really seem to resonate with the audience. Starting any project that way not only level sets on what matters and level sets everyone on what matters, it surfaces themes the teams can constantly check themselves against to make sure what they're building is going to ultimately matter to the audience that they're trying to talk to. It naturally forces an outside-in perspective, which can often become harder and harder for marketing teams to get, particularly as the company scales and grows. So at the end of the day, it can actually be a good thing that teams are talking to different people, so long as they're unified in what those key motivators really are, and the business and its offerings are being framed in terms of how they address them. In other words, so everyone's consistently communicating why you're different and why it matters. I don't know if you're like me or not, but whenever we're launching something new, big or small, I'm hitting refresh in my browser about 20 times an hour to see who's liking it, who's commenting, who's sharing, who's picking it up. It's funny because my logical brain knows these things take time to catch on, particularly when they're complex services or products. But my egotistical, emotional self just wants everybody to see it immediately and to love it. So about 6 or 7 years ago now, we were working on a project that had a pretty big social footprint. So the first few posts start careening across the different channels. And of course, my refresh starts going crazy. And I remember this one post went up, and within like a minute or two, we had over 1,000 likes. It was that moment where I paused. I was like, oh my God, we are going viral. This is amazing. Grab the champagne. Until someone walked over to my desk and pointed out the harsh reality that about 98% of the likes were actually coming from employees of the organization, who were not exactly our target audience. And as disappointed as I was that they weren't yet resonating with the people that we intended, I was also kind of amazed. I'd always worked for small and mid-sized companies. It had never really occurred to me just how powerful a channel employees could actually be. So I started poking around looking at other posts, and none had as much engagement internally or externally as that one post really did. So I realized if we had thought a little bit more strategically about our rollout, we actually could have done a lot more, a lot faster, leaning into the people who actually worked for the company, particularly those that were closer to the work that it was representing. Here's the thing. It's not a big deal if employees aren't super engaged with some simple social posts. But in large businesses, if employees aren't on board, they can ignore the higher profile, more important projects too. There's just so much to get done. There are so many different groups, so many different budget centers. You can get your creative fix in so many different places in a large organization that people don't have to jump on the bandwagon with whatever it is that you're working on, no matter how many stakeholders might like it or appreciate it. So that takes us to the third hole, one that's a mirror image of Holy Moly's Polcano. You've done the heavy lifting. You've sold the executives. Legal and design have given you the green light. Production is complete. Assets are ready to go. It's all downhill. Then boom, your colleagues totally reject it. Even worse, they radically change it. Sales decks in the field look totally different. The nuance of your beautiful tagline is totally lost. Your image is hacked into unrecognizable diagrams, by the way, that are totally off-brand. Employees can be one of your best channels, but they need to be set up to play the role that you want or maybe need them to play based on what it is that you're trying to drive forward. It's really an effort to both enable and empower them to not only understand, but to use and improve whatever it is that you've built. When it's done well, it's an open invitation to make things better. That not only drives engagement, but also investment and accountability, which is when we tend to see the best content really take flight. Obviously, enablement can vary pretty wildly based on what it is that you're trying to deliver. For example, if you just have a few new assets, simply loading them into the appropriate marketing and sales enablement platforms, and then popping into a couple of meetings just to let people know that they're there, talk about how to use them, that'll probably get the job done. But for larger campaigns and more complex messaging work, it might actually warrant a pretty well-orchestrated team effort to really scale. There are a few different levers you can consider pulling to really drive adoption for what it is that you're working on. Setting expectations, dedicating time, and recognizing efforts. Let's break them down. If full-scale adoption for the work across marketing is important for whatever it is that you're doing, consider helping people understand what's expected of them throughout the rollout. So for example, if you're rolling out new positioning, you'll want to make sure people not only understand it, but that they can use it and make it better. A clear roadmap might look something like this. In week 1, I understand and I'm bought into the positioning. By week 3, I can tailor and use that positioning. By week 5, I can not only use it, I can make my current work better. You can take that even further to tailor each of those statements based on the role someone plays. So for example, if you're talking to brand or advertising professionals, in week 3, it might be, I know where our current advertising needs to be adjusted. Then in week 5, it's, I know what I'll change and how I'm going to change it. By contrast, for content marketers, Week 3 might be, I have a hypothesis about what thought leadership themes we need to double down on. Whereas in week 5, it might be, I know who I'm going to work with and what we're going to build to elevate our thought leadership. Simply telling people what they need to do doesn't tend to be enough. It helps to show them you're invested by giving them the room and the support that they need to meet those expectations. Consider bringing the materials into regular team meetings. It's a great way to encourage engagement. Invite team members to bring different things that they face on the day-to-day and talk together about how the new messaging or marketing or materials could be used in those different efforts. Who doesn't want a little recognition for good work, particularly if that work is aligned to what everybody's talking about? Consider inviting teams to submit real-world examples of ways that they've used the content or messaging that you're working on in real-world client scenarios or with prospects or particular partners. Periodically recognizing those great ideas across the team can go a long way in establishing the behaviors you want and getting the buy-in for the work. So there you have it. You've made it. You made it through the stakeholder maze of hole number 2, getting the right people in the boat the right way to keep your timelines intact. You've traversed the minefield of audience segmentation, figuring out why your business matters and which groups it matters most to, conquering that dreaded Dutch courage. And you've rallied, enabled, and empowered your colleagues, scaling the daunting volcano. But it does highlight one really interesting point. This audience applied, interviewed, and trained for an obstacle course. This one, on the other hand, it really didn't. Larger businesses are always going to be complex. That's not going to change, but they don't always need to be as complex as they are. The bigger a business gets, the further removed from the core purpose and passion people can become over time. When you're dealing with smaller companies or even bigger companies where everyone uses the products or services, we find marketers are more emotionally attached to what they do and why they do it, which gives them the confidence to do better work and to bring things to market faster. Purpose and passion needs to be constantly revisited. It needs to be shared and, most importantly, aligned on in light of what's going on in the market and what's happening within the business. Those are important things that are going to keep those complexities in check. Hopefully this session gave you a few pointers or a few ideas of how you can improve your game and maybe knock a couple of points off your handicap, or at the very least, got you interested enough to check out Holy Moly. If you have any questions, thoughts, ideas, or you're looking for help, you can find me or any of the other folks from Brand Publis on LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the event.